Electronic logging devices. Again, these topics were chosen basically based on questions. The topics, the more questions we get, those are the topics we thought would be valuable. If there are other topics, other questions on other things, again, we've got a lot of expertise in the room, and we're happy to, take on other topics as we get to the end. So ELDs, just kind of an update as to what's happened, what is happening, and what's going to happen, with ELDs. And when we talk ELDs, there's all kinds of different perspectives. Depending on who you talk to, what is their perspective. So I'm going to talk about the FMCSA perspective, roadside enforcement perspective, and we've got a couple of roadside enforcement guys here, so if I get it wrong, please let me know. But the information that I'm going to share comes from attending conferences with FMCSA, with state roadside folks, obviously with truckers, with vendors, and a lot of conferences with the IFTA and IRP folks, which I'll tell you about. So different perspective is what's happening. So let's talk about the FMCSA perspective first of all. So this is a slide from the FMCSA. I don't know if you can read it, but it starts out November 2017, and this is hours of service compliance improves with ELD rollout, and it is the percentage of driver inspections with at least 1 hours of service violation. So you can see in November of 2017 and December of 2017, when the ELD mandate came out, 1.19% of inspections, there was at least 1 hours of service violation from all the inspections done. As the months roll forward, as ELDs are mandated, so you have January, February, March, and you can see the graph, and it goes all the way through November of 2018. You can see the graph that the hours of service violations that the FMCSA collects has gone down. So in their opinion, ELDs are working as far as reducing hours of service violations. When I heard that, I was skeptical because I hear a lot of things happening out within the states. The states have to capture that data and report it up to the FMCSA. And there are states, I was reading an article last week where New York finally adopted legislation within its state. A lawsuit was thrown out that it now can start enforcing ELDs. So up until like last week, they were not enforcing ELDs in New York. So how does that data reflect into what the FMCSA is telling us? So I was skeptical. So I then asked Oregon. For those of you that don't know, there's a motor carrier transportation advisory committee meeting that meets once a month with the motor carrier division of ODOT, and David McCain is in charge of enforcement. So at last November's meeting, based on a question that I asked, how is Oregon? What are their findings? Because I wanted to compare it to with what the feds are saying. So he came up with these statistics. And for those of you that don't know, Oregon is probably about 33rd in the country with as far as 33rd place with the number of trucks registered in the state, based in the state. So we're 33rd. California and Texas have the highest number of trucks, probably about 10 times as many trucks based in those states as Oregon. But Oregon is always, year after year, number 1, 2, or 3 in the number of inspections that it does. So Oregon's method for compliance and safety is very aggressive roadside inspections. They do a lot of them, and especially in comparison to other states. So Oregon has a lot of data. Oregon does a very good job of training their inspectors. So I knew in asking the question that I'm not going to get information based on none of the inspectors knowing enough about ELDs to even do an inspection. So Oregon provides very, very good data when it comes to this. So in this data, this line, the top of the line here is 2017 data, and to compare it against 2018 data, and he did the same time periods through October. So in 2017, total inspections done was just about 30,000 by Oregon. Out of service, driver out of service rate was 14.7% of the inspections put the driver out of service for an hours of service violation. Vehicle inspections, 30.5% of the vehicles were put out of service for some sort of vehicle violation for an out of service rate. So that's the starting point. You can take a look at 2018 data. So all inspections was 26,000. So they did fewer inspections. David didn't feel that the fewer inspections related to anything in particular, but 26,000 inspections is still a very significant number. So take a look at how many hours of service violations Oregon found. 2,957, or an 11.5% out of service rate. So it dropped over 3 percentage points from the year before. But if you look at vehicle, it remained virtually the same as far as the out of service inspection rate. So again, an indication that ELDs have done some good as far as reducing out of service violations. A little bit more detail with specific violations. 2017, 11-hour violations, there was 410. 2018, 159. Driving after 14 hours, 793 in 2017 and 249 in 2018. Driving after the 70-hour, 8-day rule, or 67-day rule, 103 in 2017, only 18 in 2018. False record of duty status dropped significantly. Not current dropped very significantly. No record of duty status dropped in half. No ELD skyrocketed. So again, this was verification to me that the ELDs, as far as reducing hours of service violations, they are working. But the bigger, larger question that is still unanswered is, are ELDs improving crashes or reducing crashes and reducing fatalities? Those statistics aren't available yet. It'll be interesting to, those statistics are usually 1 or 2 years behind, and it'll be interesting to compare those statistics with these statistics. If we are actually, yes, we're reducing hours of service violations, and yes, we are reducing crashes and fatalities, then yes, the program is working. Right now, it's just, we've got some data, and it's looking good, but there's more data we need to really determine. So what else did the feds find out with this from the feds' perspective on ELDs? One size does not fit all. They were, the ELDs being very precise. Every different type of operation out there has a little bit different needs and the flexibility needs that it needs to record hours of service, and the ELDs didn't allow that flexibility. And folks got really excited about that in a way that they were in the FMCSA's face. They were in their congressman's face saying, this ELD does not fit my operation because. Since 2015, nearly 50 exemptions have been granted by the FMCSA because they listen, oh yeah, okay, yeah, it doesn't fit. Yeah, you can no longer, hide that within the 15-minute increments of a paper log. ELDs are too precise, so we're going to grant you an exemption until we get this figured out. So now they've got over 50 exemptions. They've been hearing it from Congress that, industry needs more flexibility. And as I mentioned, Ray Martinez is the new administrator appointed by President Trump. He is industry as a group has very much approved his time as administrator. He's really listened and attended lots of listening groups and is proposing adding some flexibility to the hours of service regulations. Now, we were supposed to know what those changes were by today, but because of the government shutdown, those are still, they need the Office of Management and Budget to approve their recommendations, and that is shut down. So until that opens back up and their backlog clears, we won't really know what the hours of service changes will be. In the presentation later, I'll go over what is on the table and what I think will happen. But the ELD mandate from the Fed's perspective working, but yeah, there's definitely a need for flexibility, and they are listening, which doesn't always happen. So that's a good thing. From the roadside perspective, and again, this information, I heard from David McCain, and I know there's a couple gentlemen back there that could probably add to it. The biggest problem at roadside is, what the heck is it? Is it an ELD? Is it an AOBRD, which is the old technology that's grandfathered in until this December of 2019? Or is it just a phone app that looks like an AOBRD or an ELD? Is it one of the 50 exemptions that I, as an inspector, I obviously have to know what those exemptions are? An ELD, there's over 340 different brands of ELD out there. AOBRDs, there are brands out there that are calling themselves AOBRDs, but they don't officially meet the definition. There is an official definition in the rules of what an AOBRD is supposed to be, and if it doesn't meet those, I think it has to be integrally synced with the ECM, just like an ELD. An AOBRD has to capture date, time, speed, engine hours, something else. If it doesn't do one of those things, it's not an AOBRD. It's all it is a phone app, which is illegal. And so the inspector has to figure all that out. So that is the biggest challenge at roadside. And you guys agree back there? Yep. So other things that have been discovered, in the tech software world, you log in to your software, and they have discovered that in instances, perhaps there may be more than one login for a particular driver. You'll log in as one person, and this is what's displayed, and displays it to the enforcement. And he has another login that would show something entirely different. So the driver feels good because his phone looks good, but behind the scenes, the data that gets transmitted, all that data spits out and he gets caught. But they're trying everything out there, from what I understand. Driver edits. We had a client, their process of editing ELD data was to unplug the darn thing and plug it back in 300 miles later. Made his phone thing look, his graph look good, but the data that's transmitted, very bad. Personal conveyance has been another a huge opportunity to abuse, and has been abused. Warren, is Warren make it? He's on his way. Warren's going to talk about personal conveyance because there's still lots of questions on personal conveyance, and I'd rather him answer them than me. So we'll talk about personal conveyance here in a bit. So roadside inspectors are dealing with it. They are making it work. Inspection time has increased, or can increase, especially if the driver has little knowledge of their system and can't explain it easily. Then the research has to begin at roadside, and they have to go through all these different scenarios. Hey, is it an ELD? Well, I don't know. Is it an AOB? Well, I think so. Or he says, I'm exempt. Well, what's your exemption? Well, I was just told I'm exempt from having to have it. Well, they need to research all that. inspection times increase. So sometimes fall back to what they know, which is show me the display or print it out. Typically you can't print it out from a truck, but so show me your display. Very familiar with that. Just before Christmas, had a visit from one of my ex-employees that worked for us on the clean fleet side, and he worked for us for a couple of years, but had a passion to be in law enforcement, and was able to secure a job as a Wyoming trooper. And so he's been a Wyoming trooper for a couple of years now, and came back at Christmas to visit. So I asked him about his experience with ELDs as a trooper, and he said, depending on the situation, especially if it's not a stop to specifically do an inspection, it's a stop for something else, but he's got to go through, the basic questions for the driver. He says, typically I don't have time to really figure out if it's an ELD, AOB, or DRD. I ask, some spot check questions. Show me your supply of paper logs, which is very easy. Do you have it or not? That's a requirement. If he doesn't have it, okay, you're in violation. Show me your ELD instructions. Again, very easy for the driver to do, easy question to ask. If he doesn't know what you're talking about, it's a violation. Basically, he's enforcing the driver's required knowledge of the device. The trooper, he's saying, I'm trying to secure the scene, I'm trying to make the truck safe, I'm trying to stay safe, trying to figure out this ELD in a roadside stop that's something that is because of something other than inspection is very difficult and time consuming to do. So he said by a few questions I can tell whether we need to get this driver off, and then we need to investigate this further, or yeah, he sounds like he knows what he's doing, so let's get on with things. So all right, so let's go to the trucking perspective, and wow, has it helped? And again, it depends on who you ask. And ELDs is technology. It was mandated technology. I contend that even without the ELD mandate, that not going to telematics within your truck, it's not going to work long term in your business. I mean, everything is moving towards technology. So when you ask a trucking company, a trucker, does ELD work for you? It comes down to how do you perceive technology. And when adopting technology, there's 5 different categories of adopters. There's the innovators. There's the ones that, gosh, I hate doing this by paper. I need to figure out a way to do this. So I'm going to innovate something. I'm going to work with somebody, and I'm going to fix it myself. Then you've got early adopters. When in doubt, choose change. I know this is, some people are making this work. I want to get on this because I see an advantage to it. It'll reduce my expenses or improve my revenue, or both. Then you've got the early majority, who think change is inevitable, except from a vending machine. I like that quote. So they adopt it, and then you get the late majority, and a quote from Woodrow Wilson: "If you want to make enemies, try to change something." And then lastly, you have the laggards, and changing is what people do when they have no options left. So with the ELDs, you've got innovators, early adopters, early majority that have really put effort into this, and I think the reports from drivers, once it's sunk in, is they don't want to go back to paper. And the early adopters are finding ways to make the ELDs do other things besides ELD. And they're making it work and are finding value in it. The late majority and the laggards are going to have to catch up because it's not going to go backwards. So what are the challenges for trucking with ELDs? First of all, it's just understanding and getting through the installation process, which takes training, takes management training, it takes staff training, obviously it takes driver training. Next is internal controls. There are different things that you have to manage with an ELD than you did with paper. You need internal controls to look at unidentified trips, and what are you going to do with those? So it takes adapting, and then then it's repeating it again and again, and management, evaluation, and the commitment to the program to make it work and say, yeah, it's doing the ELD thing. This will really help me out if it can do this, and depending on what your operation. And typically, the technology is there for it to improve your operation beyond just the driver ELD portion. The quote I liked here is, after you've done a thing the same way for 2 years, look it over carefully. After 5 years, look at it with suspicion. After 10 years, throw it out and start over. And that's a quote from Alfred Edward Perlman, and I was curious who this guy was. Turns out he's in transportation, but he died in 1983, before all this technology stuff. He was saying that in 1983, and it's never been more true than it is today. And probably those time frames are even less. So, all right, let's take a look at it from the vendor perspective, and we do have a vendor here. So again, if I'm lying, please correct me. I'm not lying. If I don't know what I'm doing, you can correct me. So this was a slide from, again, the FMCSA. Again, it's a little fuzzy, but connectivity, reporting the data in an ELD is obviously the most critical part. And it comes at a time where there's a little bit of stress. The driver is being asked to transmit the data from the ELD. And from the vendor, this has been a huge problem, at least at the beginning. A lot of technology, software programming and such goes into an ELD to make it an official ELD. But it comes down to, once the software is there, is getting the data in it so that it reports correctly. So when the ELDs first came out in December, and they ran those submit your data to the EROD FMCSA website or portal, only 36.9% of the transmissions were successful. In January, it bumped up a little bit. February, it leveled off, only 44%, less than half. March and April, it started to take a jump. And the reason it started to take a jump was the FMCSA said, okay, we're to make a data transmission successful to ERODs, these fields are required, and it required all these different fields. And then they said, well, some of these really aren't necessary to really hold somebody accountable for their hours of service. So we will still want that data, but if it's not there, we will accept the transmission. And so they backed off a little bit on some of their required information. They're still asking for it, but if it wasn't there, it was not going to reject the transmission. And once that happened, you started seeing the 67, the 79, the 81, the 86% success rate in transmission. So, again, this was provided by the FMCSA and an ELD provider. And I think from the vendor perspective, again, connection is the biggest problem, and a lot of that problem was the system. I'm providing you as a vendor the ELD, but it's you for the carrier that needs to make sure all of that data is there. And if it's not there, the transmission is going to be in error. So it was training, probably on the vendor's part, to the carrier. Well, this is how you fix that. And so maybe areas of training was needed. Driver's not given the right level of permissions. Again, in the back end, you have to set up the driver and give them the right to transmit. And if you had that switched off, it could create a problem. No process to manage the unidentified trips. They just mount up and there's no hours available or whatever. There's internal processes, which again, it could be a vendor. It's all new to the carrier. The vendor has some responsibility for training and letting them know how they have to manage that system. So these were things that that the vendors were running into constantly. It's getting lots better. I want to mention malfunctions. Data diagnostics must be managed, and malfunctions. There isn't a ELD out there that doesn't have a malfunction once in a while. There's too many moving parts electronically, I guess. An ELD has a lot of programming in it. It must communicate with an ECM in the truck. So a Volvo ECM is manufactured a little differently than a Freightliner ECM, but the ELD has got to talk to it, both of them, or all of them. A model 2001 truck, I can guarantee you their ECM is different than an ECM out of a 2019 truck. The technology has improved. The ELD has to talk to them all. And there are times when they don't communicate so well. We have seen when we look at some of the data from our clients using ELDs, we'll see one day where the truck went 2,000 miles. Wait a minute, that can't happen. If the client is just using it for an ELD, the FMCSA really, okay, that's an error, we can get by, but if they're using that 2,000 miles to report their Oregon weight tax miles, all of a sudden there's 2,000 miles on there that shouldn't be there. What's that, $300 at an 80,000 pound truck rate? I mean, if nobody's looking at that data and spotting, and it's easy to spot, you just go down all the list, and with that one, it's 50 miles here, 20 here, and there's 2,000 here. Those need to be identified, and they happen with every single ELD. We work with Geotab, we work with eRoad, we work with Keep Truckin', we work with PeopleNet, we work with Fleetistics. We see them everywhere. They're there. So if you don't have a system looking at them, those need to be managed, especially if you're using that data elsewhere. So that's Canadians' perspective. Along with legalizing marijuana throughout their entire country, Canada is also going to have an ELD. It's going to mirror the U.S. ELD so that they can function similarly, but it's not official yet. It's not a rule, but it's coming. So Canada will have an ELD. From the IFTA perspective, and again, this is where we get involved a lot on our end in the tax reporting, is, again, what I just said about the data. And I attend a lot of IFTA conferences with their auditors. There's actually one next week in Las Vegas. And the auditors run up against ELDs. And the ELDs are creating big, significant problems within the IFTA world. IFTA will take electronic data, as will Oregon and their weight mileage take electronic data. You can get that data from an ELD, but not all ELDs are the same. They have requirements for the FMCSA. For example, the FMCSA say you need to collect a ping or a location every 60 minutes or at an event, which is an event would be turning the truck on or off. That's a requirement with an ELD. On the IFTA side, their requirement is it must collect distance sufficient enough for me as an auditor to be able to trace where you went. So there's discretion on the auditor's side. Does 1 hour pings work? And I can tell you that an auditor, if they're not getting data that's at least 15-minute pings, they are questioning it, because they don't think 1 hour pings or anything greater. You can drive around and accrue mileage, which affects your taxes, and so they question it. And the other thing, an ELD doesn't require to have a ping when you cross the state line, so that you can easily calculate how many miles you had in that jurisdiction. So that's not required in ELD. But in IFTA, that's one of the key components, is the accurate mileage in each and every jurisdiction. each and every state. So there's differences, there's similarities, but if the auditors are finding that they'll go into an audit and the carrier says, yep, I've got electronic data, it's accurate, it's the most accurate it's ever been, and then the auditor says, well, okay, give me the records. I'll call up the ELD vendor, and the ELD vendor, well, we only keep those records 6 months. Does anybody know how long you're supposed to keep IFTA records? It's 4 years plus your current quarter that you're in, 5 years. So they're finding they go back to the vendor doesn't have the data. Or maybe they switched vendors in the middle. The old vendor has the old data going back 3 years and beyond, and the new vendor has this, the current data. The data does not become available, and if the auditor doesn't have the data, it is, they basically say it's insufficient records, and your penalty and fine is a lot. So they're having to, the fines are becoming a lot bigger, and it's because the carriers are not understanding the differences and similarities. Do I recommend using electronic data for IFTA? Absolutely. It can save you a lot of time, but you need to know what you're doing, and making sure that you're looking at the data and that it's accurate. So that takes us to what's next. Obviously, full compliance with ELDs is coming this December, meaning AOBRDs are no longer will be allowed. They'll have to be on if you're required to do a record of duty status, a log, you'll have to have an ELD. So there's another big learning curve, last minute panic coming that we experienced a year ago December when the mandate happened. So that's coming. It will make the job of the enforcement guys on roadside much easier. You can just eliminate the whole AOBRD question and now just focus on ELDs and are you exempt? So that's what's coming in ELDs. Again, are ELDs here to stay? And I just say without a doubt. Will there be more changes coming? Without a doubt. If these hours of service rules happen, FMCSA is going to have to give all these vendors time to change their programming to accommodate the new hours. So I read a statistic yesterday that there's 13 million telematics devices out there. It's expected in the next 3 years to jump to 20 million devices out there, and it's not because of ELDs. It's because they need to have technology in the trucks. There's a lot of benefit for the combination ELD and camera. That's the big driving factor, and mostly being driven by the insurance companies, that we need those cameras in there because it'll prove our innocence in these accidents. And it's the numbers, 75% of the accidents are caused by four-wheelers, but I think it's 75% of the crash rates, the dollars that are involved are paid for by the trucking company. So the insurance companies are trying to do some, cameras will do it.